I got married in a converted carriage house on Benefit Street in Providence, Rhode Island. The brick walls were still rough in places. The rafters were strung with cafe lights, and the old wooden doors framed a view of lilacs and a bright blue May sky. It smelled like lemon oil and old timber, the kind of scent that makes you think of repaired things, not new things. I wore my grandmother's veil with the tiny pearls, and I walked down the aisle to a string quartet that my best friend, Nora, found on a budget site for $300. We used mismatched thrift store vases that cost us $68 for the lot, folded our programs at the kitchen table, and chose a single-layer cake that the baker promised would taste better than it looked for $125. It was not lavish. It was honest, and it felt like me. My parents did not come. 6 months earlier, they had thrown a grand wedding for my brother Andrew at the Plaza in New York City. Some orchids hung like clouds, a 12-piece band that learned his favorite Springsteen song, and a cake so tall it needed a hidden dowel to keep it upright. I remember the number my mother sang over dinner as if it were a hymn, $220,000. She said it with a satisfied pause while my father swirled his Merlot and nodded, pleased with the way elegance can be purchased by the pound. They told the story again and again, each time adding a detail, each time reminding everyone that the Lanes knew how to host a night that would be remembered. For me, the text I woke up to on my wedding day said, "We are sitting this one out. Enjoy your little party." I stood in the tiny dressing room and stared until the words trembled. I was supposed to be checking the pins in my hair and the hook on the back of my dress, but all I could see was the phrase "little party" and the space where my parents should have been. Outside, through the cracked window glass, I could hear Ben's laugh rise and fall in the courtyard. Ben, my husband-to-be, was there in a dark navy suit with a small grease stain near the cuff that I knew came from his shop, and I loved that. He did not try to hide it. He is a mechanic. He owns Harbor and Highway Motors in Portland, Maine, where he rebuilds old engines and converts vintage cars to electric. He smells like cedar soap and cold metal, and he washes his hands before he touches a carburetor as if a machine deserves respect. I fell in love with that careful habit before I knew what it meant for everything else. 5 minutes before the ceremony, my resolve slipped. I called my parents. I wanted to offer them an easy way out, a place to step back into the day and pretend they had not tried to hurt me. I wanted to make it easier for them than they had made it for me. "Where are you?" I asked. "We are about to start." My mother answered with a sigh that landed like a stamp on wet paper. "Enjoy your wedding with a mechanic. We do not want to feel embarrassed attending a loser's wedding." I laughed. I could not help it. The sound came up before I could swallow it, and it surprised even me. It was not a happy laugh. It was a relief to escape. "Why are you laughing?" my father said. I could picture his face, red and pinched, the way it gets when he thinks he is in charge and someone refuses to play along. "Hold on," I said. I stepped into the hallway and raised my phone to the open doors. Ben stood by a silver Aston Martin that he had rebuilt for a client from London, a car delivered that morning as a surprise for our getaway. The light polished the curve of the fender until it looked like a coin. Next to him, with her hand on my bouquet, was Judge Amelia Price, who had agreed to officiate because Ben had fixed her late husband's truck and refused payment, the kind of refusal that creates a debt you want to repay with kindness. On Ben's other side stood Gareth Hol, a British investor from Mayfair Capital who had flown in the night before and insisted on walking our rings to the front. He had backed Ben's new retrofit kit for classic cars, the one already licensed to a firm in the United Kingdom for $3.4 million over 2 years, with a follow-on option if the rollout went well. I framed all of them in one shot, pressed the button, and sent the photo. The calls started 5 seconds later. First my mother, then my father, then both of them, and then Andrew. The screen filled with their names as if they were arriving late, to a party they had mocked. Miles, Ben's best man, took the phone from my shaking hand, switched it to silent, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He did it the way a good friend closes a window before a storm, quick and calm. No speech, no fuss. Nora adjusted my veil. The quartet began to play. The door opened. There was Ben, steady as a winter pine, standing in a suit he had pressed that morning after changing the serpentine belt on a customer's truck because she needed to get to a job interview on time. He reached for me with steady hands, and when his fingers found mine, the room narrowed until all I could see was the path between us. I walked down that aisle with my heart beating hard and easy at the same time. I said my vows like a promise I had been ready to make for years, and I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. We kissed. The room cheered. Somewhere in Miles's pocket, my parents and my brother kept calling, but for the first time in my life, I did not pick up. In the photographs, you can see the reflection of the old doors and the lilacs, but what I remember most is the way my shoulders dropped when Ben whispered, "You are safe now." During cocktail hour, the courtyard smelled like rosemary and warm cement. We had rented bistro tables and covered them with linen runners that Nora stitched from clearance fabric for $40, and I loved them more than any ballroom I had ever walked through in heels that pinched my toes. Gareth clinked his glass and proposed a toast so brief it felt like a blessing, to useful things and honest love. Judge Price hugged me the way a woman hugs a daughter she would claim if given the chance. Miles pulled a tiny notebook from his inside pocket and crossed off the words, "handle phone," and I wanted to cry from the kindness of that small list. Ben and I made plates of brisket and potato salad. We used forks that belonged to the venue and napkins that my friend Tessa hemmed at her kitchen table while we drank coffee and worried whether my parents would change their minds. They had not. The quartet played an old Ray Charles tune that made my feet itch to move, so I tugged Ben to the center and we danced. Our first dance was not rehearsed. We turned the way you turn when you know the other person is listening with their whole body. The grease stain on his cuff caught the light and looked like a smudge of shadow, and I loved it more in that second than I had loved any polish in any hotel ballroom. When the band took a break, Miles returned my phone. He showed me the screen with a look that asked a question he did not say out loud. 22 missed calls. I nodded. I did not know yet whether I would call back. I only knew that I would not hand my peace to people who had set out to break. I stepped out to the stone steps and sat where the sun had warmed the slate. The laughter behind me felt like a heartbeat, steady and patient. I listened to one voicemail. My mother's voice was tight and bright at the same time. "Clara, why is that man at your wedding?" She meant Gareth. She meant the way power looks, when it wears a scarf and chooses a quiet corner instead of a stage. My father came on next, formal in the way he gets when he is worried. "Call us back. We need to talk." Andrew's message was shorter. "What game are you playing?" I set the phone beside my bouquet and stared at the lilacs until the purple blurred. I should tell you something here because this is my story and I want it to be clear. My house is a small place in Portland, Maine, with a crooked porch and a front door that sticks in August. We bought it for $329,000, and we saved for the down payment by cooking at home and cutting every subscription we could stand to lose. It is not fancy. It creaks when the wind picks up. It holds us anyway. That house has taught me more about love than any lecture my parents ever gave. You do not make a good home by buying a chandelier. You make a good home by fixing the hinge and sitting at the table even when the room is quiet. Back inside, Nora handed me a glass of water and a napkin because she knows that crying makes me thirsty. Gareth asked if the Aston Martin could be moved a few feet for a photograph, and Ben obliged with the careful attention he pays to everything he touches. Judge Price sat with my Aunt Lydia from Providence, who has never forgiven my parents for certain old sins, and they laughed like women who have kept each other's secrets for years. When the photographer asked us to gather for a group shot, Miles stood behind the camera and called out, "Family of the bride, come in close," and he looked straight at me when he said it, as if to promise that you can choose who stands beside you. It was not a perfect night. The sound system hiccuped once. The bartender ran out of limes and used orange slices for the last round of gin and tonics. One of the cafe bulbs flickered and died. I remember all of that, and I remember thinking, that imperfection was the seal on something real. I remember that I did not look at the door to see if it would open and close on people who had not wanted to be there. I looked at Ben's hands and the faces of my friends, and at the car that had been reborn by patience and stubborn love. At the end of the night, Ben held my shoes while I walked across the courtyard in my bare feet. The stones were cool. The air smelled like rosemary and sugar, Miles pressed my silent phone back into my palm and said, "Decide tomorrow, not tonight." I nodded. He was right. Some choices deserve the quiet of morning, not the heat of hurt. We climbed into the silver car that had traveled across an ocean twice and rolled through Providence's empty streets like a couple of kids who had borrowed something too nice and promised to be careful. In the bed and breakfast on Hope Street, the window was open and the curtain moved like a slow breath. I lay awake with my hands flat on the sheet and felt the day stack itself inside me, piece by piece, until it made a shape I recognized. I thought about the word loser and how people use it when they are afraid to lose control. I thought about the photo I had sent and about the calls that followed. I thought about how laughter is not always joy. Sometimes it is a shield that lets you walk through a door that should have been open already. In the morning, I would decide whether to pick up. That night, I decided something else. I decided that my life would be measured by the work of our hands, by the names of people who show up when the lights are simple, by the feel of a door that sticks and then opens because you lean your shoulder into it together. I decided that love can be both the engine and the brake, the way a good mechanic knows when to press and when to let up. And I decided that if my parents wanted to see me, they would have to do what I had done all along. They would have to come to the door and knock. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, in a colonial that looked like it had been cut from a magazine. There was a stone wall that never shifted in the frost, boxwoods trimmed into obedient spheres, and a lawn that did not dare grow wild. Inside, my parents kept life in tidy columns. My mother, Margaret Lane, measured the world in centerpieces and seating charts. My father, Thomas, measured it in square footage and quarterly reports. When my brother, Andrew, got engaged to Sophie Whitman, they surged forward like a well-trained team. My mother built a spreadsheet for the floral count, and my father secured a rooftop after-party by calling in favors. They loved a plan that could be itemized. The only time they went strangely quiet was when I started dating Ben. They did not like Ben's shop on Forest Avenue in Portland, Maine. They did not like his hands, nicked and healed and nicked again from a week of honest work. They did not like his truck with the dent on the passenger door, the one he did not bother to fix because it was ugly, not unsafe. They did not like that we toured a small white house in Deering Center with a crooked porch and said, almost in the same breath, that we could make it ours. When we bought it for $329,000, my parents said my life had shrunk. What I felt instead was a life that finally fit. The first week in the house, the front door stuck every time the noon sun hit it. The plaster in the dining room was cracked like a river map. The staircase wore a runner that looked clean from a distance and like defeat up close. Ben set a notebook on the kitchen counter and wrote, "House Ledger" on the cover. We decided we would write down every expense to the dollar. $8 for hinge screws so the cabinet doors would stop sagging. $58 for a second-hand light fixture we rewired on a Saturday night, the two of us hunched over a how-to guide and laughing when the breaker tripped. $900 for insulation because the wind climbed through every seam, and my shoulders could not take another winter of bracing against it. When I pulled 120 tiny nails from the staircase treads and found oak underneath, I cried and laughed at the same time. It felt like rescuing a thing that had been waiting for us. Ben is a mechanic, yes, but that word does not hold everything he is. He has an engineering degree from the University of Maine, and a mind that treats every challenge like a puzzle that deserves patience. I watched him design a safety coupler for battery conversions at our dining table. He spread sketches beside a bowl of clementines, tested small iterations in the shop, and returned to the table with new lines and notes. He filed the patent himself, with help from Helena, a retired lawyer who lives down the street. Helena likes lemon cookies and clear language. She sat in our living room with a red pen and a grin and said, "This is good work." And I believed her before I believed the paperwork. The first time the coupler left Portland, it rode in the belly of a Jaguar that belonged to a collector in Beacon Hill. Ben had converted the car to electric and spent 3 days in Boston test driving, in slow circles through a neighborhood that looked like money had invented it. On the 4th day, he called me from a curb, breathless and quiet at once, and said, "It works." The collector told a friend, and that friend told Gareth Hol, an investor, from London who preferred modest entrances. Gareth flew to Maine on a March morning that stung the teeth. He stood in our driveway with his scarf pulled close and watched Ben show him the kit like a teacher who still remembers joy. Gareth is not a man given to loud praise. He said he believed in modest beginnings, that close strong. He said it with a softness that carried weight. The deal that followed was not a miracle. It was work that turned into an opportunity. Gareth backed Ben's retrofit kit and helped license it to a firm in the United Kingdom for $3.4 million over 2 years, with a follow-on if milestones were met. Ben set up letters of intent to supply parts to 3 small shops in Vermont and New Hampshire. He kept working the bays and answering the phone and staying late to help a customer whose car stalled 2 blocks from the shop. When I told my parents about the license numbers and the letters and the fact that we could fund our renovations in cash, my father nodded once and said, "So he is still a mechanic." My mother said, "Do not be naive, Clara. Marriage is numbers." They were right, just not in the way they meant. Marriage is numbers, but not the kind you protect with a velvet rope. I watched Ben spend money on other people every day. He replaced a radiator for Denise, a single mom who arrived at the shop pale and apologetic with 2 kids in the back seat and steam coming through the grill. He wrote her a receipt that let her pay in tens whenever she could and taped it in the ledger so he would not lose it. He ordered a part for Leo, a high school kid saving for community college, and when Leo tried to hand over a wad of crumpled bills, Ben wrote paid in full in the book. He picked up a bouquet for me after a week when everything seemed to break, at once and tucked the folded receipt under the vase. $12.99 for tulips. Worth $1,000. There were other numbers I tried not to count and could not avoid. For Andrew's wedding, my parents dipped into a fund that had been meant for me. The money came from the sale of my grandmother's small bungalow in West Hartford. She had told me, in a voice that smelled like peppermint tea, that it would help me buy a place of my own. After she died, the money went to a general family account so that paperwork would be simpler. When I brought it up, my father said he had done what was best for the family. I lowered my head and went back to scraping wallpaper in a room that would one day be our bedroom. I told myself that paint can cover a lot, but it cannot cover everything. By spring, the house had started to look like a place that remembered joy. Ben painted trim by hand every night for a week. I scrubbed baseboards with a toothbrush because the grooves caught more than a sponge could reach. Helena came by with a folder and lemon cookies and told us she had filed the final patent papers. We took a picture of the staircase and sent it to Nora with the caption, "Look at this miracle." She responded with a stream of hearts and the offer to sew curtains from a bolt of linen she had found for a song. When the porch sagged just enough to worry me, Ben slid a new board into place with a careful tap of the hammer and said, "There. That is better," and I felt the house exhale. It would have been easy to hide the good news from my parents and then spring it on them when it could not be ignored. I chose to tell them as the pieces clicked into place. I sent my mother a photo of the dining room with the caption, "We saved $200 by rewiring this ourselves." And she wrote back, "Hire someone next time." I called my father to tell him about Gareth, and he said, "Watch yourself. People like that always want something." I wanted to say that everyone wants something, even if it is only for a daughter to marry a man with smoother hands. I did not say it. I let the silence carry the message I was not ready to send out loud. In April, Ben proposed in our half-painted kitchen. He had flour on his sleeve from the pizza dough we were wrestling into shape, and he was nervous in a way that made me love him more. He did not kneel. He leaned against the counter and held up a simple ring with a small oval diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. My yes arrived before he finished the question. We stood there with stickered paint chips on the cabinet doors and dough on our fingers, and a future that felt both ordinary and bright. We set a date in May and decided to marry the way we had chosen our house. Small and honest and ours. We asked Judge Amelia Price, who had become a friend after Ben fixed her late husband's truck and refused payment, to officiate. We strung the lights we already owned. We borrowed chairs from a neighbor who ran a thrift store. We picked a one-layer cake and hired a quartet that Nora found for $300. It felt like building a room around a single piece of furniture you love. I still wanted my parents there. I wanted them to see what I saw when I watched Ben work, and when I watched him rest on the porch with a glass of iced tea and grease ground into the lines of his hands. I wanted them to see how a man can be gentle without being weak. I wanted them to sit at our table and notice the way the late afternoon light turns the cracked plaster gold. I called them a month before the wedding. I explained the plan and the guest list, and the budget we had tracked to the penny. I told them the Aston Martin might make an appearance because the owner was passing through Providence that weekend. My mother went quiet and then asked about the menu. My father asked about parking. They said they would let me know. They let me know the morning of the wedding. They were sitting it out. Enjoy your little party. I read it while the kettle whistled and Ben scribbled a reminder to pick up ice. For a full minute, my heart felt like it was walking into a cold room. Then I looked up at the house that had held us through a winter and at the man who had pulled 100 nails with me, and I thought, I am not small. My life is not a little party. My life is this table and this porch and this person who writes, paid in full when no one is looking. When I told Helena what they had written, she put 2 lemon cookies in a napkin and told me that families are old houses. If you want to live in them, you learn which stairs creak, and you decide which doors you will close forever. If you are lucky, you find a room where the light is right, and you spend your days there. I decided she was right. We would build our room with the light we had. We put the extra board under the porch. We strung the lights. We borrowed the chairs. We asked Judge Amelia to stand with us while the people who loved us best made a circle around the hard work we had done. I pressed my dress and checked the hook at the back and packed a pair of flats in a tote. I did not know that a few hours later I would send a photo that would make the phones in my parents' house ring like alarm bells. What I knew for certain was simpler. The house with the crooked porch was steady. The door was still stuck at noon. Ben's hands were nicked and healed and nicked again. I loved my life exactly as it was, measured not in centerpieces or square footage, but in the good weight of a man's hand finding mine and the sound a front door makes when you push through together. The calls did not arrive all at once. They came the way gulls shadow a boat when they sense food, one after another, persistent and sharp. By the end of cocktail hour, Nora had taken my phone, turned the sound off, and slid it into the glove box of the Aston Martin with a little click that sounded like mercy. Inside, the room smelled like rosemary and warm brick. Ben and I made plates of brisket and potato salad and 2 kinds of pickles that a neighbor had packed into jars as a gift. We stood at a high table and ate with the unsteady relief of people who have just crossed a thin bridge and found solid ground. When the quartet shifted to a Ray Charles tune, Ben smiled in that quiet way he has and extended his hand. We danced, without steps. His cuff still had the faint ghost of that grease mark. I loved it as if it were a signature. Gareth found me near the doors while the air cooled. He spoke in his soft London cadence about the kit, how a firm in Manchester had requested a technical brief and another in Edinburgh wanted a demonstration on their floor. He asked if we could come to London in the fall. He said the word London, like a person naming a street he can walk in his sleep, full of memory and plain affection. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He looked relieved, the way people do when a wish finally says its name out loud. The band took a break. Miles retrieved my phone for a quick check. He raised his eyebrows, not dramatically, just letting me see the number on the screen. 22 missed calls. He waited for me to tell him what to do. I told him I would step outside. The stone steps were still warm from the sun. I sat with my skirt tucked under my knees and called my parents back. My mother answered on the first ring, as if her hand had been hovering over the phone. Clara, why is that man at your wedding? What man? I said, though I knew. The investor from Mayfair. Your father has a proposal waiting on his desk. He is meeting him in Boston on Tuesday. Do you understand how this looks? I let a small laugh escape. It did not feel triumphant. It felt like air leaving a room that had been held too tight. How does it look? It looks like we are being shut out, my father said, his voice joining the call in that unmistakable baritone that has steered and stalled so many decisions in our family. We did not know you were connected to him. Why did you keep this from us? I stared at the lilacs. A bee nosed into the blossom as if my parents were not speaking in my ear at all. You told me not to call attention to my life, I said. You told me to enjoy my little party. Silence. Then my mother tried a new key. We should come by. We will drive tonight. You are not invited, I said, and I could hear how my voice changed as the words gathered weight. Not tonight. They called again. They texted. Andrew wrote in all caps. What game are you playing? Sophie sent question marks like confetti that had forgotten how to celebrate. I set the phone beside my bouquet and went back in. Gareth was teaching Miles to say garage with the British softness, and Miles kept laughing at himself, and I ate a slice of lemon cake while Ben stole the frosting with a fork, and Judge Price congratulated the baker as if he had argued a case, and won. Later, when the chairs were stacked and the lights were down to a few brave bulbs, and the Aston Martin purred at the curb like a secret, Miles pressed the silent phone into my hand. Decide in the morning, he said. He was right. I tucked the phone into my bag and climbed in beside Ben, and we rolled through Providence with the windows cracked and the smell of river and lilac mixing with the clean scent of the car. At the bed, and breakfast on Hope Street, the ceiling wore the shifting square of moonlight like a shawl. I lay awake and let the day walk through me until it reached a quiet corner. There, a different thought took a seat. Lane Fabrication. My father's. Shop in Hartford, 38 workers on 3 shifts. Sheet metal, duct collars, elbow joints. The shop had leaned against hard years, and my father had refused to trim his salary. He had refused to bring in a partner. He had refused to try a younger engineer's line change that might have cost $10,000 up front and saved $40,000 by Christmas. Pride is expensive. It takes and passes the bill around as if someone else should sign. I fell asleep near dawn and woke to the smell of coffee and the soft creak of old floorboards. We drove north on I-95 with the windows down. The highway light flickered through the car like a film. In Newburyport, we stopped at a diner with a neon lobster that buzzed even in daylight. We ordered pancakes that slid off the plate and a side of bacon that crackled in the skillet. Ben paid in cash and tucked the receipt into his wallet. He pays for first breakfast in cash, a small rule he treats as a charm. I counted out the change in my palm like a string of beads and felt steadier than I had any right to feel. When we turned onto our street in Portland, the crooked porch looked like it had been waiting for us. The rosemary plant on the step had survived the weekend. A card sat on the mat with a narrow ribbon. Helena's handwriting, practical and kind. Come have tea when you are ready. I breathed out. We carried our bags inside and set them on the rug we found for $60 at a yard sale. The house said all the things houses say when they know you. Hello. You are heavier with new vows, and you are safe. Ben leaned his shoulder against the doorway and watched me take off my shoes. If you want to help them, we can talk about it, he said. If that is the shape of the peace. I do not want to help them because they are afraid, I said. I will help them if they apologize. He nodded. He did not argue. He did not point out the advantages. He trusts my sense of the room. It is one of the reasons I trust him with everything else. We made coffee and sat at the table he had built from 2 boards and a set of school legs he found at an auction. The house creaked, the way old houses do when they settle a little, like a person pulling a blanket toward the shoulders. I felt every year of it under my feet, and I felt strong. By Wednesday, the sharpness in my chest had softened into clarity. I took out paper and wrote a letter to my parents and Andrew. I did not explain to Gareth. I did not mention the photo. I wrote about boundaries, what we could talk about, and how. I wrote that if they wanted to discuss business, we would do it face-to-face at our table. I wrote that the conversation would begin with 3 words. We are sorry. I mailed the letters with stamps I had been saving because they had a little lighthouse on them. It felt correct. 2 days later, a text arrived from my mother. We will come on Sunday at 2. No flourish, no apology in print. I took that as a small sign of respect. She would speak the words in person or not at all. On Sunday, I wiped the table and set out 4 mugs. I put lemon cookies on a plate because Helena swears that citrus persuades better than sugar alone. I did not cook more. I wanted nothing that could be mistaken for an eager welcome that had not been earned. Ben tightened the hinge on the screen door and left his tools in a tidy row on the porch railing. He looks calm when he is nervous. Can tell by the way he watches my face for the smallest flinch. They arrived at 2 on the dot, as if punctuality could substitute for contrition. My mother carried tulips that did not look like they had come from a grocery store. My father looked smaller at the shoulders. He glanced at the Harbor and Highway Motors mug on the counter, and then away. They sat side by side. The house listened. My father cleared his throat. He has used that sound to begin 1,000 conversations that did not make room for anyone else. This time, he let the space hang for a moment, and when he finally spoke, he did not give a speech. He said 3 words. "We are sorry." My mother nodded. "We are sorry," she said, and for a second I saw her as a girl in an old photograph, chin lifted like a dare, and eyes asking for kindness she could not name. The shock of it loosened something I had been holding too tightly. I did not rush to fill the air. I let the apology land and find a chair. I looked at Ben, and he looked back at me with the kind of calm that makes a person brave. Only then did I stand and reach for the kettle. I made tea. The simple act felt like a hinge turning. We did not discuss Gareth right away. We did not discuss lane fabrication or meetings in Boston or any numbers in pounds or dollars. We talked about the porch and the cracked plaster and how the rosemary survived our wedding weekend and how Judge Amelia sent us a postcard that arrived with a smudge of postmark ink across her signature. We spoke like people who had decided to start at the threshold instead of rushing to the far room. I learned that my mother had felt invisible at her wedding, long ago in New Haven, a detail she had never shared with me. I learned that my father had started lane fabrication with a man who left the partnership after 10 months, and that ever since then, every conversation about help sounded to him like a slow goodbye. None of that excused the harm. Knowing it made the harm look like a thing with edges I could hold. When we finally turned to business, I asked them to listen before we debated. My father folded his hands. My mother folded her tulip wrapper into a neat strip. The house was very quiet. Outside, a neighbor's screen door opened and shut. Somewhere on Maple Street, a child laughed. All of it felt ordinary and large at once. That afternoon did not finish the story. It moved the story out of a room where everything echoed and into a room where words could land without breaking. By the time the teapot was empty, we had not solved anything. We had done something better. We had agreed to speak again on Wednesday at 7 in the evening here at our table. We had agreed to keep the first 15 minutes for respect and not for strategy. We had agreed to tell the truth even when it made us look smaller. After they left, Ben and I stood on the porch and watched their car turn the corner. He slid his hand into mine. The rosemary brushed my ankle when the wind shifted. I looked back at the table through the window. The 4 mugs stood in a line like a promise. I felt the shape of the next days gather itself, the way a good plan does when it is made by people who finally understand what matters. The panic had been loud. The quiet that followed felt like a door we could open without breaking it. They came on a Wednesday evening when the light from Maple Street slanted through our front windows and made the dust look like confetti in slow motion. We had agreed to meet at 7. I set 4 mugs on the table and a plate of Helena's lemon cookies in the center because she swears citrus helps people tell the truth. Ben sat cross-legged on the rug with a pad of paper and a carpenter's pencil. My parents took the couch we had muscled up the stairs on moving day. They looked smaller than I remembered, and I do not say that to be cruel. The armor they wore in ballrooms and boardrooms did not fit in our living room. We did not talk about business first. We spoke about the porch and how the rosemary plant had survived another hot week. My mother smoothed her skirt and nodded in the careful way a person nods when they are taking shallow breaths. My father stared at the Harbor and Highway Motors mug on the table, then at the ledger book we keep for house expenses. He asked if the extra board under the porch had held. Ben said yes, and added that sometimes a single true piece of wood does more good than another layer of paint. I saw my father register the sentence, and I wondered if he would hear it later as advice. Then Ben opened the pad. His voice was gentle, the same tone he uses with a customer who is worried about money. He said Gareth had not appeared at my parents' Boston meeting by accident. Gareth had called him on Friday, asked about lane fabrication, and said the shop looked sound, but underfed. Gareth had asked if Ben would consider a partner's solution. My father blinked in the slow way he does when he expects a trick. He asked, "Consider what?" "Buying a controlling stake," Ben said. "We would put in $1.2 million to keep Lane Fabrication open and modernize the line. You would step down as CEO and stay on as a paid advisor for 2 years. We would bring in a plant manager from Boston who has ventilation experience. Everyone keeps their job. The shop stays in Hartford. The goal is stability, not fireworks." My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father looked at me, not at Ben. His eyes were wet in a way that made me feel like a child and an adult at once. He said, "This is your idea. I said it was ours." I told them I was not buying approval, and I was not interested in a bargain that cost respect. If they could not apologize to Ben and mean it, we would not talk about money again. Not on Wednesday, and not ever. Silence stretched until it turned into a presence of its own. I watched a dust mote spin in the beam from the window like a small planet. My mother lowered her hand. She said she had been cruel, that she had wanted to be seen in a certain light, that she had forgotten love does not need a spotlight. She said she was sorry to Ben. He nodded and thanked her, and I watched his shoulders drop 1 quiet inch. My father tried a joke and lost the thread, then tried the truth and found it. He said he thought he had been protecting me from a life of scraped wallpaper and stolen joy. He said he had not seen that I already had the joy. Ben tapped the floor with 2 fingers and said, "Her joy is right here." We turned to practical things. Ben laid out a plan like a good mechanic lays out tools. First, an audit of the line to see where energy leaks and time disappears. Second, a purchase of 2 new presses that would pay for themselves in 18 months if scheduled correctly. Third, a partner for Thomas in the office so he would not try to hold up the roof alone. Gareth would provide a bridge facility in pounds if the timing of the presses and the license payments crossed in a bad way. In return, Lane Fabrication would agree to a new safety protocol and a training plan that lifted 3 senior floor workers into shift leads within 6 months. The numbers were simple on paper. The real work would be the words between people who had stood back to back for too long. We met again on Friday with Helena at the table to translate feelings into sentences that money can obey. She wore her reading glasses halfway down her nose and marked the margins with a slow red pen. She made my father laugh once by telling him he was allergic to short paragraphs, which was accurate. By the end of the night, we had a letter of intent and a handshake that felt like a real thing, not a performance. My mother took a cookie for the road. My father stood in the doorway longer than he needed to and looked at the hinge he had mocked, the year we moved in. He asked what kind of screws we had used. Ben told him the size, and my father nodded as if the house had finally let him in on a secret. The deal closed in July after a June full of inspections and signatures. Gareth reviewed the papers from London and called me at our kitchen table. He said he was pleased in that airy London way that means very pleased. He said the pounds and the dollars were the easy part, and the respect was the hard part, and that we had chosen the hard part on purpose. On closing day, Helena took a photo of the 4 of us under the old Lane Fabrication sign. We looked like people who had crossed a river together and were trying not to look down at their wet shoes. 2 weeks later, a new sign went up. Lane Fabrication, established 1987, rebuilt 2025. The word rebuilt made my father tear up. He said the shop had been made once out of loans and luck, then held up by stubbornness, and now it would be held up by a plan. The new plant manager, Amelia Ruiz, started on a Monday and walked the floor with a clipboard and a smile that made people want to explain things well. By Wednesday, she had reorganized the loading bay, which saved 20 minutes a shift. By Friday, she had a schedule that gave the oldest worker, Mr. Carmine, time to sit during the last half hour without losing output. People notice when respect comes in on legs and not as a memo. At home, the porch felt steadier under my feet. Ben had sanded and sealed the boards, and the rosemary plant threw a brave green scent even in the heat. My mother asked me to text paint swatches for the guest room because she wanted to come visit for a weekend and did not want to insist on a hotel. She did not mention the plaza or orchids that looked like clouds. She sent me a photo of the tulips from our first Sunday and said she had pressed 2 of the petals between wax paper. I put my phone down on the table and cried a little, then laughed at myself and went to check the hinge one more time because I am still me. Andrew took longer. He sent me a line that said, "I am trying." I believed him. Sophie came by with a casserole in a glass pan that had belonged to her grandmother. She asked if she could see the attic because old houses make her feel like the ground has a memory. We climbed the narrow stairs and stood under beams that had held snow and heat for more seasons than I can count. She told me she was pregnant. I hugged her in that awkward way people hug when they are balancing good news and long habits. We found a box of curtain rings from another decade and took them downstairs to make wind chimes for the porch. The sound is thin and sweet when the night turns. Ben and I finished the last section of the porch railing and bought a narrow dining table with 2 leaves for $30. We sanded it until it gleamed and left our fingerprints in the polish because a house should remember who loved it. I printed the photo from our wedding, the one with the silver car and Judge Amelia and Gareth in his scarf, and put it on the mantle in a frame I found at a yard sale. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the glass and think, that woman learned to measure her life in good weight, not loud rooms. In October, we flew to London for the demonstration. The plane touched down in rain that felt familiar and kind. We stood on a concrete floor while engineers with neat notebooks asked clever questions. Ben spoke about torque and safety, and the way a battery should be treated like a heartbeat. He demonstrated the coupler with steady hands. I spoke about houses and doors and the way a small room can hold big love if people remember to take turns at the threshold. Gareth translated our American corners into British curves when needed, which is a skill I will always admire. On our last night in London, we walked along the Thames and counted bridges because it felt like counting blessings without being obvious about it. Ben squeezed my hand twice, our small code for "I love you." We talked about making our Portland house a little bigger on paper, not by adding rooms, but by adding names to the guest list. We talked about inviting my parents for Thanksgiving and about saving up for a second bathroom. Ben wants a new lift for the shop once the letters of intent in Vermont and New Hampshire become firm orders. I want bookshelves that reach the ceiling in the room that gets morning light. We agreed to set aside a small fund every month to help someone on our street, because it turns out that giving money away is a better feeling than watching it sit in a ledger. When we came home, the rosemary was still alive, a little wild at the tips. Helena had left lemon cookies and a newspaper clipping about our wedding with a note that said, "I always liked a mechanic." We set our suitcases down on the rug and listened to the house breathe. Old houses make a sound when people who love them come back through the door. It is a low sound, almost a sigh. If you live in a place long enough, you learn to hear it. Every so often, I take out my phone and look at the photo I sent on my wedding day. I see the man they called a loser, standing between a judge and an investor, in a courtyard we made beautiful, with borrowed chairs and a string of lights that flickered once and then held. I see myself in the car's reflection, a woman who learned that forgiveness is not a discount. It is a new contract written by steadier hands. I see a circle of friends who made a room feel large without making it loud. If you come over, I will show you the porch and the place where the new board sits like a promise. I will pour coffee and tell you how we paid for the insulation that first winter. I will say the names of the people who helped us. Nora, who sewed the runners. Helena, who drew up the papers and brought lemon cookies. Amelia Price, who married us and sent a postcard that still smells faintly of ink. Gareth, who likes stories and scarves. Denise and Leo from the shop. Miles, who slipped my phone into the glove box to save my heart. I will say Margaret and Thomas, too, because redemption deserves a place on the shelf. Then I will hand you the mug that says Harbor and Highway Motors, and ask about your house and your door, and the way your life opens when you push together. And if our door sticks while you are here, I will put my shoulder into it the way Ben taught me. Some doors open with force, and some open with patience, and some open with an apology that lands before any numbers do. Ours opens with both, and with the quiet knowledge that a good life is built the way a good machine is built, one honest part at a time.